Hey, world history students. I hope you're having a good start of the week. We're on week like 6, I think, of distance learning. We have about 4 more to go. And so last week we wrapped up the Holocaust, and today we are going to start our next phase of world history, which is World War II. So as the Holocaust is going on, the Nazis are in control of Germany, and they're systematically trying to eliminate what they consider inferior races, particularly people of the Jewish faith, but others as well, as we have learned. While all this is going on, the Nazis are also engaging in a major war in which they are trying to conquer and take as much land as possible. They feel as though because they are the master race, that they deserve a lot of living space, a lot of Lebensraum. So they are trying to conquer a lot of territory. And they team up with 2 other countries who are kind of doing the same thing. There are also militaristic countries that are trying to take a lot of land, a lot of territory. And so they're going to team up together. And then countries like the United States of America and the United Kingdom and eventually the Soviet Union are going to team up to stop them. And so this is what we call World War II. And so for our next couple lessons, we are going to study World War II and what transpired. Today is going to be the introduction to World War II. We're going to go into essentially what led to not the Nazi Party being able to remilitarize Germany and start this massively global war. And then tomorrow and next week, we'll actually do the actual war, and then yeah, and then we'll move on to the Cold War after that. So again, just to put things in context, as we studied the Holocaust last week, the Holocaust was happening at the same time as World War II. So everything we studied last week about the Holocaust, all of that is going on as this war is taking place. All right, so I just wanted to make sure we had that kept in mind. So let's go ahead and start. All right, so again, we are studying World War II and the Holocaust. In general, when we think of World War II, we usually think of the years 1939 to 1945. I have a lot of question marks there, though, because not all historians agree with that version of World War II, and I'll explain why here in a second. So this is a map of the world. And the reason I want to show you this is because I want to explain to you the different aspects of World War II we are going to be studying. So what you have on this map, you have these sort of orangish colored countries that are what we would call the bad guys. These are what we call the Axis powers. The United States was not a part of this group. World War II is kind of interesting because it really is one of the wars. No one does really good things ever in war on either side, but World War II is one of those wars where there's sort of like the good guys and the bad guys. And the Nazis are definitely the bad guys. And as we study today about the Japanese, you can kind of see that it's pretty easy to paint them with that same brush. Not that, all the allies are really nice, like the Soviet Union is definitely not a really great, model of a country that you would consider a good guy country. They do some terrible things, and even American soldiers during war will commit some atrocities. Nobody is truly ever a good guy or when it comes to war, because that's the nature of war. But in World War II, there's definitely some countries that do a lot more bad things than others. So again, in the orange you have the Axis powers. You have Germany and Italy, and then eventually some of the territories they take from France. So those are the Axis powers over here in Europe. Likewise, they team up with a country we know as Japan. Japan is also in orange, so it's Japan, Germany, and Italy together make the Axis powers, who we in America consider the bad guys. And then all the blue countries are all the countries that eventually sign on to being a part of what are called the Allies. Now, a lot of these countries do not contribute a lot to the actual war effort, but regardless, you can kind of see there are a lot of blue countries, not a lot of orange countries. When we talk about World War II, there's essentially 2 different theaters, or 2 different sections that we talk about. We talk about what is sometimes referred to as the war in the Atlantic side. So you have the war over here in Africa and Europe. There's also what we call the war in the Pacific. The United States primarily fights this, a little bit of help with Great Britain, but the United States fights a lot of the war in the Pacific on its own against Japan. So again, you have the war in the Pacific. We'll talk about that a little bit, and the war in the Atlantic. Those are the 2 theaters of World War II. Now, the reason that we talk about World War II, and I put question marks like when did World War II really begin? Technically, the European part doesn't start until 1939, but in terms of the Pacific War and the Japanese expanding their empire, that actually starts way back in the 30s. Japan is a young, well, it's a really ancient country, but in terms of it being sort of a more modern, industrialized country, it's relatively young. And it's a very militaristic, meaning it relies a lot on its military leaders. And the Japanese, similar to the Nazis in Germany, feel themselves the superior Asian race. They feel as though they are sort of like the ultimate Asian nation. And at this time, just like the Nazis are going to try to expand their empire, Japan's going to do the same thing. The thing about Japan, similar to Germany, is that even though they have a very large military, they don't necessarily have the resources that they need to keep that military going. They don't have all the oil, particularly oil. They don't have all the oil they need, all the coal that they need, all those things that are needed, all the iron they need in order to maintain a very strong military. So in 1931, they invade a part of China called Manchuria, which has a lot of resources that the Japanese need in order to have a successful military. And the Japanese were a part of the League of Nations at the time. Again, the League of Nations was formed at the end of World War I to try to maintain diplomacy between countries so that there weren't wars that would break out. And the League of Nations, even though it didn't really do all that much, it did condemn Japan. It said, Japan, you should not have done that. This was bad. This was wrong. And the League of Nations is going to sort of step up and try to condemn Japan and get them to give Manchuria back. And what the Japanese end up doing is they say, nah, that's fine, League of Nations. We're out of here. We aren't going to let you tell us what to do. We feel as though that we're doing what's best for Asia, we're doing what's best for Japan. In their mind, what was best for Japan is what was best for Asia. And their delegation actually stood up and walked out. And again, it's showing kind of the weakness of the League of Nations. The Japanese had an emperor, Emperor Hirohito, and in theory, the idea is in the Japanese culture is the emperor is almost like a divine person, sort of seen as a god, and the emperor in theory is in charge of Japan. In reality, it was a very militaristic country, and the military leaders had a lot of power over the emperor. The emperor had final say on a lot of things, but the emperor deferred greatly to the military leaders of the time. So the military had a lot of power. But this is Emperor Hirohito, and he is going to allow the expansion of the military and the Japanese Empire. So in the 1930s, as Japan is expanding, China, the other major power in Asia, is having their own issues. If you remember, China is a country that has been forced open by Western culture, and there's going to be a lot of people in China who are going to be very discontent, and there's going to be a huge civil war that happens, and we'll study this briefly when we go into the Cold War. But this civil war is going to happen where there's going to be a growing communist movement that wants China to turn communist. And so you have this war between communists and non-communists trying to take control of China. The leader of the Communist Party is a man named Mao Zedong, and he's going up against the person that we as America would support, a man named Chiang Kai-shek. But regardless, we'll talk more about that in later episodes in the Cold War. Because what happens is in the 1930s, there's a ceasefire between these two Chinese leaders because they realize Japan is a bigger threat. And Japan does invade China in 1937. Japan is going to, it thinks it's going to be able to have a very easy victory over China. They feel China's too divided and too backwards. So Japan does have a lot of success, but not nearly as much success as they initially had planned for. And in particular, they're going to conquer a city in China called Nanking. And I'm going to play a little bit of a video. I'm not going to show it because it's just so graphic. It's similar to the Holocaust. The Japanese people, Japanese soldiers in particular, kind of felt them to be felt themselves to be morally superior to pretty much every other group of people in the world. And in particular, when the Chinese or when the Japanese um, take Nanking, they are going to perform just countless awful, disgusting atrocities. This is called the Rape of Nanking. And essentially, similar to how the Nazis did unspeakable cruelty to Jewish populations, to the Roma, to the Jehovah's Witnesses, um, to LGBTQ peoples, to political dissidents. The Japanese are every bit, if not even more, gruesome and grotesque in some of the things that they do as they are conquering territory and conquering land. So I'm going to play a little bit of a video here. I'm only going to play the audio. I cannot show you the video in good conscience, and I'm not even going to play the full audio that goes into detail about this, but here is the Rape of Nanjing, and so we'll listen to it together.
After finally defeating the Chinese at Shanghai in November, 50,000 Japanese soldiers then marched on towards Nanking. Unlike the troops at Shanghai, Chinese soldiers at Nanking were poorly led and loosely organized. Although they greatly outnumbered the Japanese and had plenty of ammunition, they withered under the ferocity of the Japanese attack, then engaged in a chaotic retreat. After just 4 days of fighting, Japanese troops smashed into the city on December 13th, 1937, with orders issued to kill all of the captives. Now this is the part of the video where I shall have to tell you that you will be watching at your own risk, as the next following images contain highly graphical images, which some of you may find highly disturbing, but please bear in mind this was an unhumanely true historic event. Their first concern was to eliminate any threat from the 90,000 Chinese soldiers who surrendered. To the Japanese, surrender was an unthinkable act of cowardice, of the ultimate violation of the rigid code of military honor drilled into them from childhood onwards. They then looked upon Chinese prisoner of wars with utter contempt, viewing them as less than human and unworthy of life. The elimination of the Chinese prisoner of wars began after they were transported by trucks to remote locations on the outskirts of Nanking. As soon as they were assembled, the savagery began, with young Japanese soldiers encouraged by their superiors to inflict maximum pain and suffering upon individual prisoner of wars as a way of toughening themselves up for future battles, and also to eradicate any civilized notions of mercy. Film footage and still photographs taken by the Japanese themselves documented the brutality. Smiling soldiers can be seen conducting bayonet practice on live prisoners, decapitating them and displaying severed heads as souvenirs, and proudly standing among mutilated corpses. Some of the Chinese prisoner of wars were simply mowed down by machine gun fire, while others were tied up, soaked with petrol and burned alive. After the destruction of the prisoner of wars, the soldiers turned their attention to the women of Nanking, and an outright animalistic hunt ensued. Old women over the age of 70, as well as little girls under the age of 8, were dragged off to be sexually abused. Throughout the city of Nanking, random acts of murder occurred as soldiers frequently fired their rifles into panicked crowds of civilians, killing indiscriminately. Other soldiers killed shopkeepers, looted their stores, then set buildings on fire after locking people of all ages inside. They took pleasure in the extraordinary suffering that ensued as the people desperately tried to escape the flames by climbing onto rooftops or leaping down onto the street. The incredible carnage contained citywide burnings, stabbings, drownings, strangulations, rape, thefts, and massive property destruction continued unabated for about 6 weeks. From mid-December 1937 through the beginning of February 1938, young or old, male or female, anyone could be shot on a whim by any Japanese soldier for any reason.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. Like I said, I know it's just listening to something without seeing images is kind of odd, but I can't in good conscience show you some of the images of the rape of Nanking. And the Japanese soldiers in this, it's one of the most infamous infamous things that occurred during World War II, and that even includes concentration camps and death camps. What happened to the citizens, the Chinese citizens in Nanking, was just grotesque. And what the Japanese forced some of the citizens to do to each other is just grotesque. A lot of the Japanese soldiers were young, and they were being sort of conditioned by their military officers they're trying to condition or get the Japanese soldiers to unlearn humanity, trying to get them to unlearn compassion. They wanted their soldiers to be compassionless. They wanted their soldiers to kill without thinking thinking twice about it. And so they encourage Japanese soldiers to do these terrible things to try to program these Japanese humans to 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 kill without mercy, without feeling bad. Just absolutely horrid stuff. And but we've already sort of done these. So that's gonna some historians say that this is really the beginning of World War II. At least it's the beginning of the Japanese portion of World War II. Generally speaking, when we think of World War II, though, when we study it in America, we really focus a lot on the European aspect and the beginning of the war in terms of Nazi Germany starting World War II. And so here's what we're going to study then is how the war starts in Europe. We just went over kind of what happened in Japan or in Asia with the Japanese leaving the League of Nations and essentially trying to expand their empire. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, when they come to power in Germany, want to do a lot of the same thing. They want the Aryan race to have living space, a living room. Lebensraum is the German word for it. And right away, Hitler and the Nazis are going to start to violate the Treaty of Versailles. If you remember, one of the things about the Treaty of Versailles is that the German military was only supposed to have very limited amounts of soldiers, no tanks, a very limited navy. Um, Once the Nazis take over, and it wasn't just the Nazis, the Germans were already escalating and militarizing even under the Weimar government, but the Nazis are going to really escalate. He is going to rebuild the German Air Force. He's going to really grow rapidly the Nazi military. And he is also going to send soldiers back into the part of Germany called the Rhineland. And according to the Treaty of Versailles, that part of Germany was not supposed to have any military presence. These were all clear violations of the Treaty of Versailles. And France knew what happened. It's not like they did it in secret. Well, some of it was in secret, but a lot of it they did out in the open as well. And France and Great Britain and a lot of these European powers, they kind of knew what was happening. But the League of Nations and France and Great Britain, they chose not to step in. They said, Hitler, you need to stop doing this. And Hitler said, whoa, just relax, everyone, calm down. You know, we're just trying to rebuild the German integrity. We gave up a lot for the Treaty of Versailles. We're just going to do this little bit here. And eventually France and Great Britain sort of said, okay, but don't do it again. And we call this appeasement. When you give sort of a bad person what they want, and hopes that they don't keep trying to get more and more and more. This is appeasement. So again, the Western powers like France and Great Britain and the League of Nations, they did very little to stop. And this is sort of a picture of the Rhineland. This is Germany, Belgium, France. This yellow area is the part that they had remilitarized. So again, we call this idea appeasement, where the British and the French and League of Nations are going to sort of just keep giving Hitler what he wants, hoping that that will keep him from trying to do more and more. Um, so again, Hitler's saying, I just want some living space. I'm just trying to make Germany, their economies, I'm trying to make our country strong again. Don't freak out. I'm not going to start a war here. Just give me this little bit of Lebensraum. Give me this little bit of living space. And by and large, um, France and Great Britain went along with it. So the Germans are going to end up having ally themselves with some other countries that have similar ideologies. So in particular, Germany and Italy are going to sort of unite together and form an alliance. We call this an axis, this alliance an axis. And Italy, as Germany is also expanding, Italy is trying to regrow what they consider, you know, the ancient Roman Empire. They want Italy to be have another empire kind of similar to that. So Italy is going to be invading and taking territories in Africa in particular the country of Ethiopia. And so we call this the Rome-Berlin axis. The Rome is the capital of Italy, Berlin the capital of Germany. They form an alliance, we call it an axis, in 1936. A little bit later, Germany is going to form an alliance with Japan. Same thing. They feel as though Japan Japan's ideology, Japan's goals match very well German goals, and they figure if Japan can be very strong over in Asia, that can sort of keep Great Britain and the British colonies kind of over there in Asia. It can kind of keep them focused on that part of the world. The next thing Hitler is going to do, there is a country right to the south of Germany called Austria. And in Austria, this was sort of a headquarters of the old Austrian-Hungarian Empire that Germany had an alliance with during World War I. In Austria, there are a lot of German-speaking Austrians. And Hitler has a goal of making one big united Germany, a big country. It's called Pan-Germanism, a big country of nothing but German speakers. And he's going to talk to the Austrian government, which is actually a fascist government that doesn't like the Nazis. It's kind of a weird thing. Not all fascists are created equal. But he tries to convince the Austrian government to have an alliance with him. And we call this goal of uniting Austria and Germany the Anschluss, the Anschluss, sorry, the joining together. And essentially, Germany is going to sort of bully and strong arm the government of Austria. There's a little bit more detail of it than that, but they sort of strong arm. They get some fascists in power in Austria that are very pro-Nazi, that are essentially Austrian Nazis. And then the German military just goes into Austria. This Austrian government, which is just sort of like a bunch of Austrian Nazis, let them do it and sort of say, okay, we're a part of Germany now. So Germany marched right into Austria without firing a shot. And so now Germany is reunited with Austria, which is in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Same thing, though. Great Britain and France, they just sort of say, okay, Hitler, we'll let you do this. I mean, after all, there are a lot of German-speaking people in Austria. But understand, Britain and France, they just didn't want to have to fight another war. World War I was awful, just awful. And they didn't want to have to go through all of that again. And it's easy in retrospect to look back and say, you know, Great Britain and France, if you would have stepped up early and stopped Hitler early, you could have maybe stopped World War II. But in the moment, the last thing they really wanted to do, they didn't feel ready for a war, either psychologically, emotionally, but also militarily. So the next thing, Hitler, after he takes Austria, and no one really pushes back, he's like, well, this is easy. Now he's going to demand some more territory in the country of Czechoslovakia. It's called the Sudetenland. And so in the Sudetenland, it's the area on the outskirts. It's a pretty large part of Czechoslovakia. It sort of wraps around Czechoslovakia. It has tons of resources, tons of coal. I'll show you a little video here in a second. And so Britain and France, again, they're like, oh, Hitler, shame on you. You can't just take this land. So they all meet together in Munich. And what's kind of dumb is that it's France, Britain, Germany, but Czechoslovakia, their government isn't there. The Soviet Union's government isn't there. And so France and Britain and Germany together, they'd agree to they let Germany take they let Germany take the Sudetenland. Essentially, Hitler says, I promise this is it. Give me the Sudetenland. I won't expand anymore. Great Britain, under Prime Minister Lloyd George, says, oh, this is great. We'll let you have it. Just, you know, from here on out, let's not do this anymore. Okay, Hitler? But that's just going to embolden Hitler even more. So in 1939, Germany invades Czechoslovakia. They say, okay, thanks for the Sudetenland. Now we're just going to take it. We're going to take Czechoslovakia. Oh, shoot. I said, I apologize. I'm not going to re-edit this, but it's not Lloyd George. He was prime minister at the end of World War I. Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain is the prime minister of Great Britain. He is the one who is going to consistently appease Hitler. I don't believe my brain messed that one up there. So again, so Germany then invades Czechoslovakia, and even Chamberlain, the prime minister that's sort of appeasing Hitler, he says, okay, maybe this Hitler guy, maybe I can't take him at his word anymore. And so Chamberlain is going to form an alliance with Poland because they have pretty much assumed that Poland is next on Hitler's list of countries that he is going to want to take. And long story short, there's a part in Poland called Danzig, sort of the Danzig corridor right in here. and Hitler starts what we call saber rattling. He starts to sort of say, you might want to give me this territory, Poland, or, you know, I might end up having to pull my saber out, my sword, and not literally speaking, but figuratively speaking, I might have to use my military to take this if you don't, you know, play ball with me. And so the British government, the French government, they make an alliance with Poland. They say, okay, Hitler, that's it. That's it. You've crossed too many lines. If you invade Poland, war, it's on, bro. You better not do this. All right, so I'm going to show a little bit of a video about this idea of appeasement, the idea that we just keep giving Hitler a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And I really like these videos that this gentleman does. He did a wonderful World War I series. He does a wonderful World War II series, and I love the way he talks about appeasement here. So this is again the idea of appeasement, giving Hitler what he wants, and this is this historian's take. So here we are.
Problem. Anyhow, as early as 2 weeks after Anschluss, Hitler is meeting with Sudeten leader Konrad Henlein to tell him that the Czech problem will soon be solved.
He wants to take the Sudetenland.
About the harsh treatment of ethnic Germans there, claiming they deserve to live in a greater Germany. He makes clear to the Allies that his intentions are limited to creating one cohesive nation state to restore order. Despite his string of broken promises, the British public and press believe him. The Times suggests that this is actually good for Czechoslovakia, as it will make it a more homogeneous state by the cessation of that fringe of alien populations who are contiguous to the nation to which they are united by race. The Allies and their citizens are convinced that offering Germany this concession will avoid a wider conflict. And Sudeten Germans are Germans after all. Maybe if the Allies cede just those border regions, Hitler will be satisfied, right? This is the advice they give to Edvard Beneš, president of Czechoslovakia. But Beneš refuses and orders a partial mobilization. He's not prepared to go down without a fight. The threat of direct conflict holds off a German invasion. But Britain and France are determined to work things out to de-escalate the situation. France, allied with Czechoslovakia, does not want to be embroiled in a war when they feel so unready for conflict. And the Soviet Union, at this point a friend of Czechoslovakia, cannot deploy troops without going through Poland or Romania, two countries who benefit from a weaker Czechoslovakia and who are not going to let Red Army troops onto their soil.
And this is an important thing to know, is that you think, well, Czechoslovakia, what kind of military do they have? At that time, the Czechoslovakian military was quite large. The French military was also quite large. If France and Czechoslovakia had sort of teamed up and said, Hitler, yeah, you better not do this, or we're going to, fight you on a two-front war, Hitler would have had to back down. The German military was not the military we have in our mind at this time. We think of Nazi German military as this huge, overwhelming force. At that point in history, it really wasn't. So Czechoslovakia, France, Great Britain, they may not have realized it, but they had a military. But again, at that time, they didn't want to have to fight another war. So it is what it is. Anyway, I'm going to keep on going then.
The situation is deteriorating, and the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy rushed to Munich in an emergency meeting on September 29, 1938. Czechoslovakia is not invited, nor is the USSR. After much discussion, the powers agree the next day that the Allies will not intervene if Germany occupies the Sudetenland. In return, Hitler promises that this is his last act of expansion. Czechoslovakia is pressured by Britain and France to agree to the terms and cede its territory. Poland also wins some land, managing to snatch Teschen away from Czechoslovakia. The annexation of the Sudetenland gives the Nazi regime 66% of Czechoslovakia's coal and 70% of its iron and steel. But for now, the Munich Treaty is seen as a victory for peace in Europe. Chamberlain flies back to Britain and upon arrival waves the treaty to the crowd. I'm sure we have that famous picture on the screen right now. Neville Chamberlain explains,
"We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted, to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries, and we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe.
Yeah. Well, the celebration will be short-lived, and Hitler's words will prove hollow. The Munich Agreement becomes the final failure of appeasement. Less than 6 months later, all of Czechoslovakia will be occupied in March 1939. A separate Slovakia, closely aligned with the Nazis, will be carved out, and the Czech lands will become the protectorates of Bohemia and Moravia. With Czechoslovakia out of the picture, Hitler will have crippled the opposition against him, because guess what? The combined forces of Czechoslovakia and France substantially outnumbered his, and them being on either side of Germany would have meant a costly two-front war. But the aggression has finally opened Britain's eyes. Rearmament programs now increase dramatically, but it is too late. When Germany's goal for expansion turns to Poland, it is clear that dreams of peace by exchanging guns for flowers and handshakes has brought nothing except the betrayal of one's own allies, the collapse of even more democracies, and a general sense of defeat before a single shot has been fired. The furnaces of German Nazism have fueled the fires of the Hitlerian dreams of messianic end times. If anything, appeasement has only fed the Lizard King and grown him into a hydra.
So again, terrified of instigating another war, France and Britain appease Hitler time and time again. And what they did to Czechoslovakia is just awful. Like, when I say they, I mean France and Great Britain. Czechoslovakia was their ally. Without even giving them a seat at the table, they let Hitler carve up parts of it for Germany, and then Hitler just takes all of it after that. And it's just sad because, again, you don't realize that Czechoslovakia did have a large military. France had a large military relative to Germany. Had they just held their ground, they could have stopped this. But anyway, let's go ahead, keep on going. So after Hitler takes Czechoslovakia, they set their eyes on Poland. And the only issue with taking Poland is that it's right next to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union remembers quite well the major conflicts between Germany and Russia in World War I. And Germany remembers that too. And neither country really wants to fight the other at this point. Neither country feels ready for a full-on war. So Hitler, even though he hates the Soviet Union, and Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, even though he hates Hitler and the Germans, they have a little bit of an agreement together. Because Hitler does not want to have to fight a two-front war. They don't want to have to take on the Soviet Union. So they form a non-aggression pact in 1939. These two countries that in general don't have they do have a little bit in common. They both have sort of dictatorial governments that kill tons of their citizens, but they don't really have a lot in common philosophically. They agree to essentially not fight each other, and they agree to carve up Poland. The Soviets didn't really like Poland having its own country. The Germans didn't like Poland being its own country. So they agree, both powers, to essentially take over Poland and divide it up between the two of them. And just 2 weeks after the this non-aggression pact was signed, the Nazis invaded Poland. And then a little bit later, the Soviets bring their soldiers in to occupy a part of it as well, per this agreement. But once the Germans invade Poland, finally then France and Great Britain said, okay, I guess Hitler, we're going to go ahead and declare war on you now, because finally we realize that we can't we can't trust you. We finally realize appeasement won't work. And so this is when essentially the invasion of Poland is when we say World War II began, particularly in Europe. And that's usually what we use as the line of demarcation for the beginning of World War II. Like I said, though, a lot of historians will also say the war started earlier in Japan, when they invaded Manchuria and then invaded China. But for whatever reason, we're very Eurocentric. Whether that's good or bad, it is what it is right now. So we generally regard the invasion of Poland, as the beginning of World War II. And that's where we're going to leave off today. That's how World War II started. It starts in the Pacific with Japan wanting to expand its empire. And then in Europe, Hitler just slowly gets bigger and bigger, grows their military, takes land, and nobody steps up. We use appeasement, and unfortunately, we don't, by we, I mean the Allies, Great Britain, France, they don't step up until it's way too late after Hitler invades Poland and has a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. And by that time now, the German war machine is a pretty not as big as what we think, but it's a significant war machine, and it ends up not going well to start out with for the Allies for sure. All right, so anyway, there isn't an assessment to do over today's lesson. I am going to post our SLO this week. I'd like you to get the SLO done by the end of the day Friday. I will have the SLO is not a graded assessment. Again, an SLO is meant to sort of give me feedback and give the school district feedback on how much you guys have learned this year. And I understand there's a lot we haven't got to because of everything with distance learning. Just do your best, all right? It is important to do. It's part of my evaluation, but it's also helps us to know what we need to focus on in terms of instruction going into the future. So do get the SLO done. I'm going to get it posted probably tomorrow. I need to make some fixes to it. I'm going to primarily have most of the things that we have covered already. Um, or and But there isn't going to be an assessment or anything to do for this particular lesson. On Thursday, when I post our next lesson, there will be a little bit of a Google form assessment to do. So we're actually going to get into the actual war. Poland is invaded, and that essentially begins World War II. I'll show some videos of the invasion of Poland. We'll do some other videos of some of the other things that occurred during the beginning of the war, show you some of the different tanks and stuff the Germans used, so a little bit more interactive. All right. Hope you're having a great week, and look for that SLO. I will get that posted probably tomorrow. And hope you're having a great day, and look forward to seeing you at our Google Meets tomorrow. All right. Talk to you later. Bye.